George Whitman woke to the glow of his phone in a steel bunk the size of a coffin drawer, and the message on the screen hit as clean as a hammer. I'm leaving you. I'm moving to Palm Springs with someone who understands me. I'm taking all our money. It was 3:07 a.m. local time in the Persian Gulf. The generator hum pressed through the walls. Heat lingered even at that hour. A second buzz arrived with a screenshot of the joint account, a hard zero where 6 figures had lived last week, and a kiss emoji tossed on top like a joke. George did not throw the phone. He did not swear. He stared for a count of 5, typed a single line. Sure, good luck, and powered the device down until the screen went black. He sat up slowly, touched the floor with both feet like a man checking if the ground still held, and began his day because that was the only thing that made sense. He showered, shaved, and pulled on clean cotton, work pants, and steel-toed boots. At 4:15, he walked to the galley. The night cook nodded. George took coffee, skipped eggs, and opened his logbook. He drew 2 straight lines down a blank page and wrote times in the left margin. 4:30 rounds, 05:10 transfer pump check, 05:40 compressor inspection, 6:15 toolbox talk. The routine was a ladder he could climb with his eyes closed. At 04:30, he walked the deck with a flashlight, clicking the beam across gauges, flanges, and bolts he had touched 1,000 times. He ran a hand over a hot pipe to feel if the vibration was true. He listened for a hitch in the pump tone and heard none. He marked temperatures with a dull pencil and moved on. At 05:10, he leaned into the transfer pump housing and watched the needle hold steady under load. At 5:40, he stood before the main compressor, waited for the cycle to complete, and then opened the panel to note the hours. A younger rigger named Luis asked if they would swap out brushes today or hold until morning. Morning, George said. Heat's coming. We take the heavy work before noon. He kept his voice even. He kept his hands steady. At 6:15, he ran the toolbox talk. He spoke about pinch points, heat stress, and why shortcuts save seconds and cost lives. He held up a frayed glove and let the room stay quiet for a beat so the lesson landed. He told the crew to drink water before thirst and to step out of the line if their minds wandered. He did not mention the text. Personal trouble stayed personal on steel. When the men broke, he signed the lockout sheet for a motor that needed attention and followed the path he had written for himself. 20 coolant filter change, 05 calibration on a stubborn sensor, 910 harness check on the south ladder. He stopped Luis and a welder named Faze at the ladder and made them swap out tired lanyards for new ones. Clips are sticky, he said, and held one up so they could see the grit. Sticky becomes stuck. Stuck becomes a fall. Both men nodded and changed their gear without argument. The sun rose and turned the deck to a warm plate. By 10, a haze sat on the water, and the rigs in the distance looked like toys you could pinch between 2 fingers. At 11:30, he ate quickly in the galley. Rice, beans, a slice of melon he did not taste. Then stepped into the small office off the mess to clear emails, because that was what he did every day at that hour. The first subject line had a law firm name he did not know. He opened it. The language was smooth and distant. Representation retained, divorce filed, claims of abandonment due to overseas work, request for spousal support adjusted to excessive income, contact instructed to be through counsel. He read the whole note to the last period, closed the laptop gently, and stood very still. The heat in the room felt separate from his skin. He took a pen and wrote one more line in his logbook under the 12 slot. Contact Caleb. Caleb was his cousin in Houston and an accountant who liked clean ledgers and quiet plans. At 12:05, George walked to the communications room, used a sealed address he and Caleb had shared for years, and sent a 2-word email, Frost Ledger. It was their code from long ago. It meant, pull the records, watch the wires, do not call this number. The reply arrived 3 minutes later. Already on it. Do not answer her. Land first. George set the phone face down. He went back to work because work was honest and a list was something you could finish. A weld got checked. A handrail bolt got tightened. A stubborn sensor settled after a careful recalibration. At 14:40, the site superintendent leaned into the instrument room and asked, "Everything stable?" The question carried 2 meanings. George looked up, wiped his hands on a clean rag, and said, "Everything's under control." It was true. The panel lights showed green. The men were where they should be. And inside his own head, the switches had clicked into a pattern he trusted. At 1600, he did a last walk down before the day cooled. He tested 2 emergency lights and noted 1 dim unit for replacement in the morning. He signed off on a permit to work for an overnight team changing a valve and made the foreman repeat the isolation steps back to him. When the horn sounded for shift change, he returned to his bunk, set his boots side by side, and powered the phone back on, because a person should know what waits. Texts stacked quickly. 3 from Elaine asked him to call about a banking mistake. 2 from unknown numbers offered to help during this difficult time. 1 from his neighbor back home, Harold, carried a single photo, a moving truck in George's driveway, and 2 men wrapping a tall shape that looked exactly like the oak desk his grandfather had made with his own hands. Harold had written 4 words, "Thought you should know." George stared at the photo until the screen dimmed. He thought of the flagstones he had laid last spring and the sprinkler timer he had fixed after a late freeze. He thought of the framed black and white photo of his parents that sat on that oak desk in the light from the front window. He thought of how Elaine had redecorated the living room at Christmas without a word and said the house needed a change. He did not run ahead in his mind. He did not guess at every step they might take. He stayed with what he could prove and what he could do next. He opened a password manager on an old laptop and checked a folder with a plain name. The entries inside sat like neat tools in a drawer, each where he had left it, each labeled filings, deeds, titles, accounts. He did not open them yet. He only looked to see they were still there. He closed the laptop and breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth until his heartbeat matched the slow hum under the floor. Outside, the sea pushed against steel in a rhythm he knew. A thin wind slid under his shirt when he stepped onto the lee side for air. The sky went from white to gold to gray. By the time the night shift took over the valve change, the heat had eased. He drank water, ate a sandwich he could not name, signed the last line of the day's log, and turned the page to a blank one. He drew the 2 straight lines again. Tomorrow had a shape already. Brushes at 0610, dim light at 0830, call with Caleb at 1205 on the secure line. He set his alarm, lay back, and let the dark room settle around him. He did not know every detail yet, but he knew this much. A man who lives by checklists builds his life with redundancies. Elaine had a plan. He had one, too. She had no idea it was already too late. Caleb called at exactly 12:05 the next day, the satellite line clicking twice before his voice came through. And George stood in the narrow passage outside the instrument room with his back to a cool bulkhead so he could hear every word. Caleb did not waste any. He said he had pulled the last 14 months of bank logs, and the pattern was steady and patient. Small transfers first, 2,000 here, 3,000 there. Then larger bites in the last 90 days, and the total was $208,000 slid into an account under Elaine's maiden name. He had also found a home equity line drawn and spent in a single week with a signature that looked like George's, if you only glanced. And he said the bank had already flagged it as suspicious after he sent them a copy of George's driver's license and a sample signature from a past closing. And while he spoke, George watched a pressure gauge settle and made a note to recheck it at 14:30 because work did not stop for trouble. Caleb lowered his voice and said there was more, that he had pulled a cloud backup linked to George's Apple ID because Elaine had never changed the password when she upgraded her phone. And in those messages, he had read a thread with a contact saved as D, and the texts made George's mouth go dry. Plans to leave? Jokes about a man who works dangerous, a last exchange that used the words Plan B and accidents happen, and a name to go with the letter. Dylan Hart, 25, former trainer, no steady employment on paper in 3 years, 3 prior relationships with older women that ended the same way, a move, a vacuum, and debt. George said, "Thank you," and nothing else for a long breath, then told Caleb to package everything in a clean folder and send it to Miriam Cho, the lawyer, and to the bank fraud unit, and to hold his own copy offline. At 13:10, George called Miriam on the same secure line, told her the facts in short sentences, and sent a single zip file that held the ledgers, the forged HELOC note, the cloud screenshots, and a list of items already removed from his house as captured by his neighbor's photographs. Miriam read while he waited on the line and said she would file for an emergency freeze on the siphon account, ask the bank to freeze the HELOC disbursement, and place a temporary restraining order on any sale or transfer of the house until the signature could be examined. And she added, in a flat voice that comforted George, that she would also draft a motion to dismiss any domestic violence claim if one appeared, because she would walk into court with his badge logs and passport stamps that showed 7 straight weeks overseas. At 14, George stepped out to the deck, checked the coolant sight glass, and told Luis to pull the dim emergency light he had marked the night before. Then returned to the office to see 2 new emails from unknown sender, with subject lines that read like pity and bait. He did not open them. He moved them to a folder called Hold, and he logged into the home security panel he had installed 3 years earlier, which Elaine knew about but had likely forgotten he could reach from anywhere. And he watched his living room appear in a grid of 4 clean frames. The notch in the couch he used to read in, the oak desk his grandfather had built, the hallway that led to the bedrooms, and the back slider that looked over the pool. At 14:40, the living room camera caught a man in his 20s in George's old college sweatshirt, a dark cap turned backward, lifting a bottle from George's small whiskey shelf. And a minute later, Elaine walked through with a phone to her ear and a clipboard under her arm, and she paused at the desk and opened drawers like she owned time itself. George watched with a face that moved less than the wall and let the feed run on a second screen while he finished a calibration checklist, because he had men above him in a scaffold and a valve coming off at 16:30. And he would not let carelessness join his day. At 17:10, the neighbor, Harold, texted again. Real estate lady came by, took pictures, talked fast. And Miriam, when he forwarded it, replied that she had already checked the county system and found a listing agreement signed by George W., underpriced by a third to move it fast, which told her 2 things: that Elaine wanted out now, and that someone thought a quick sale would finish the siphon before anyone could blink. Miriam filed the nullification request at 18:05 and messaged that the clerk stamped it for an early morning slot with Judge Harper, who did not like forged ink. The workday pushed on, and the sky turned brass to red and then a deep gray. And at 19:00, George walked the south rail, checked that the overnight team had tagged and locked the right breakers, and made the foreman repeat the lockout aloud because saying it makes the hands remember. At 20:15, he ate stew and bread and drank more water and let his hands rest on the table for a full minute so the shake that had tried to start in his fingers had nowhere to grow. At 21, he sat at the small desk in his cabin, opened the old laptop again, and signed into Granite Orchard LLC, the holding company he and Caleb had built 8 years back when a friend had been stripped clean in a rushed divorce. And the screen gave back calm numbers and clean filings, taxes paid, titles properly held, and the mountain cabin and the small gas royalties sitting where they were supposed to sit, separate from the joint account by design and by law. He did not move a dime. He did not rename a file. He only verified and logged out. He wrote a short note by hand on a yellow pad, 3 lines. Finish rotation. Land clean. Be quiet. Then he slept 6 hours without dreams because he had tasks to do in the morning. The next day at 06:10, he and Luis swapped brushes on the motor they had flagged. At 08:30, he signed off on the replacement of the dim emergency light. At 10:05, he walked the scaffold again. And at 12:05, he met Caleb on the line and learned that the bank had frozen the siphon account at zone 940 and the HELOC disbursement at zone 957, pending his in-person verification, and that Miriam's emergency filings were on the docket for the next morning. In the afternoon, a new voice called his regular phone 5 times and left a message about a banking mistake, and he let it go to voicemail and saved it with a date and time stamp. At 18, Harold sent another photo of the moving truck, this time with two movers carrying the old framed black and white of George's parents, and something tight pushed under George's ribs and stayed there, but it did not control his hands. At 20:30, the rig superintendent stopped at his door and asked, "Everything stable?" And George said, "Yes," because the panels were green and the court papers were moving and the men were safe. On the third morning, the company approved an early relief for George at the end of the week due to family legal emergency. And he accepted the seat on the earliest flight it could arrange after his handover, not because panic had won, but because the plan needed a body in the room. He wrote the turnover notes as if life depended on them, which it always did in his trade. And he walked each inbound tech through every open permit so nothing sagged when he left. When the week closed, he zipped his carry-on, took his logbook, and stepped onto the crew boat with the same steady gait he had carried for decades. The sea slapping the hull in a rhythm that said, keep going, and he did, with a list in his pocket and a still face and a feeling like the click of a breaker seating home. He had not chosen this storm, but he had built for it, and the next moves were already lined up in his head in the order they would come. George landed in Houston at 6:42 on a gray morning and moved like a man who knew the route. Immigration, a nod at the officer, one carry-on from the belt, a quick stop at the restroom to wash jet fuel off his hands, then straight to the curb, where Caleb waited with a plain sedan and a cooler of water. Caleb handed him a flip phone and said the main number should stay dark, then passed a thin folder with rubber bands. And they drove without the radio, while Caleb gave updates in steady pieces. Bank freeze active, HELOC flagged, emergency motions stamped for the afternoon. Judge Harper on the docket. They parked under the law firm's garage lights at 7:55 and rode the elevator to Miriam Cho's office on the 15th floor, where reception was quiet and cold, and the printer in the back room made a soft, constant sound. Miriam came out in flats in a dark sweater and shook George's hand like a medic checking a pulse. They sat at a long table. She slid him 3 stacks, one for the emergency freeze on all accounts connected to Elaine or the siphon, one for the cancellation of the forged listing and a hold against any transfer of the house, one for the criminal complaint on the equity line. George read each page, traced lines with his finger, signed where tabs stuck out, and asked short questions. Who would serve? When? What time? What door? Miriam answered with times and names. Service planned for tomorrow at 8:55 with 2 deputies and a court officer. Judge Harper would hear the emergency motions at 11:10 today. The forged listing nullification would go first. The bank had asked George to appear in person after court to verify identity. She would go with him. At 8:35, Miriam opened a 4th folder and said Elaine had filed a domestic violence petition the day before, claiming fear and control. Miriam lifted a page of badge logs and passport stamps and said, "You were overseas all 7 weeks. We will move to dismiss immediately." George nodded once. At 9:05, Caleb's tablet chimed. He turned it so George could see the home camera feed from Harold's login. Dylan in George's old sweatshirt by the pool phone to his ear, feet on the teak table that George had sanded last spring. A minute later, Elaine moved through the frame with a clipboard and a nervous walk, counting boxes with her finger and pointing toward the study. George studied the timestamp, the angle, the way the sun lay across the pavers. He said nothing. At 10:40, they sat in the courtroom's second row while the clerk called cases. Elaine and her lawyer were not there yet. Miriam whispered that emergency calendars moved fast, and people who played games with signatures often misjudged clocks. Judge Harper came in at 11:08, read through 2 files in quick, neat motions, and looked up. Miriam stood, stated names, and put the forged listing in front of the clerk with the agent affidavit and the county record showing George's name cut and pasted from an older deed. She handed up the home camera stills of movers carrying heirlooms out the door and Harold's dated photos. The judge asked one question. "Where is Mr. Whitman today?" Miriam pointed at George. The judge looked at him, then at the passport stamps, then at the badge logs. "Nullified," she said, and the clerk stamped the order. Miriam raised the domestic violence petition next, attached the same location proof, and asked for dismissal. The judge read the two-line claim, checked dates, and said, "Dismissed for lack of possibility," then initialed the margin. Next came the bank freeze and the HELOC fraud complaint. The judge signed both and ordered notice to be served with the other papers. It took 12 minutes. Miriam wrote the service time on a sticky note, 08:55 tomorrow, and slid it into George's folder. At 12:10, they drove to the bank. A manager led them to a small glass room, checked George's ID twice, took fresh signatures, and clicked through screens. The siphon account remained frozen. Disbursements from the HELOC would not release. All activity would require George's in-person authorization. The manager printed confirmations and clipped them for Miriam's file. At 13:20, Caleb's phone buzzed again. Harold reporting a real estate agent back at the house with a wide-angle camera and a sales sheet. Miriam called the brokerage and faxed over the nullification order. The broker called back and said the listing was pulled 5 minutes later. At 1400, George and Caleb drove west to Midland, a 6-hour run on straight roads. They stopped once for fuel and coffee and a sandwich that tasted like pepper. Caleb briefed the plan while the wheel hummed. In the morning, movers would return for the final load. The deputies would arrive at 8:55, block the drive, and serve both papers. A court officer would explain the 30-minute clothing-only removal rule. Harold would let George sit in his front room to watch. George would not speak first. He would say only what was necessary and then step back. At 2016, they rolled onto Harold's street. The house looked the same as it had for years, except for the moving truck's tire marks on the curb. Harold met them at his door with a thermos and a quiet handshake. He had placed 2 chairs by the front window and kept the living room lights off so they would not silhouette. He pointed across the street. Lights were on in George's kitchen. A line of cardboard stood by the island. The oak desk was visible through the study window. George felt a dull pressure in his chest and let it pass like a slow breath. They set alarms for 8:30. George slept 4 hours on Harold's couch with his shoes off and his folder under his hand. At 08:15 the next morning, he woke to the sound of a diesel engine downshifting. At 08:30, a large moving truck stopped in front of his driveway and 3 men climbed out. Elaine came to the door with a pen and a tight mouth. Dylan followed, yawning, his cap backward again. At 08:45, the movers carried boxes to the threshold and waited. At 08:53, a dark sedan eased in behind the truck and blocked it. 2 deputies stepped out, straight backs, hands free. A woman in a navy suit with a leather folder followed. Harold handed George a pair of binoculars so he could see faces without leaving the window. At 08:55, the deputies walked to the door. One spoke. Elaine's chin lifted. She called for Dylan. The second deputy waited until Dylan stood beside her. The court officer opened her folder. Harold looked at George. George nodded once, stood, and crossed the street with Caleb at his shoulder. He stayed quiet until the first deputy turned and asked, "Mr. Whitman?" George said, "Yes." Elaine's face went white, then pink, then a gray he had never seen on her. "You're supposed to be offshore," she said. George said, "Not today." The court officer handed her the orders: freeze of accounts, HELOC fraud complaint, nullification of the forged listing, dismissal of the domestic petition, and notice of divorce citing fraud and conspiracy. Dylan spoke first, loud and fast, saying Elaine was afraid, saying George was controlling. The deputy cut him off and read the line from the judge. Petition dismissed for lack of possibility. Respondent documented out of country. The court officer told Elaine and Dylan they had 30 minutes to take clothing and toiletries and nothing else. Everything else would be inventoried by the court. Movers set boxes down and stepped back. Elaine tried to argue that the silver frames were personal. The officer shook her head. "Inventory," she said. Dylan muttered a curse. George did not answer it. He looked past them into his hallway, counted the frames still on the wall, and watched the clock. At 09:28, Elaine came out with a suitcase and a small bag. Dylan followed with a duffel. The court officer checked tags and nodded to the deputies. The deputies stepped aside. George turned away. He did not watch them drive off. He looked at the oak desk through the window again and breathed once, steady and deep, like a man after a long climb who knows the ladder held. 3 weeks later, George sat at a long wooden table outside courtroom 3A with Miriam and Caleb, a stack of labeled binders in front of them, and a paper cup of water sweating onto the file marked Bank Transfers. He had arrived at 8:10 a.m., 30 minutes early, the same way he used to arrive at a ladder before a lift. Miriam spoke in calm, even sentences about the order of proof. Forged listing first, bank siphon next. Home equity fraud after that, and the messages that mentioned Plan B last, because the judge would stop there and look hard. At 8:35, the clerk pinned the morning docket to a corkboard. Judge Harper would take urgent civil matters at 9. The hallway was quiet, except for the hum of lights and the squeak of a bailiff's shoes. Elaine came at 8:52 in a pale blazer with her hair pulled back, a lawyer in a navy suit at her side. She did not look at George. She kept her eyes on the seal over the courtroom door. Dylan did not appear. At 9, the bailiff called the room to order. George took the second row with his back straight and his hands still. Miriam stood and gave the case number. The judge nodded, opened a file, and began to read. Miriam started with what could not be argued, dates and numbers. She walked the court through 14 months of transfers in a simple chart, each entry tagged to the joint account and the shadow account in Elaine's maiden name. She named each bank and showed the origin and the destination like lines drawn between 2 points. She did not raise her voice. She placed the forged home equity documents on the rail so the judge could see the slope of the signature against George's real signature from a past closing. "We have the bank's preliminary opinion," she said. "They flagged it on their own before our complaint." The judge lifted the page, compared the loops, and set it down. Miriam moved to the house listing. She tendered the county record that showed George's name pulled from a deed and pasted on a broker form, the agent's affidavit, and the clerk's nullification order from the emergency hearing. The judge read, initialed the margin, and said, "Listing declared void ab initio." Elaine's attorney rose and spoke about misunderstandings and stress. He said the listing had been a protective act to stop further financial control. Miriam held up George's passport stamps and company badge logs showing 7 straight weeks overseas, including the week Elaine filed a domestic violence petition. She gave the court the dismissal order already signed, lack of possibility, and did not add a single adjective. The judge turned to Elaine's lawyer. "Counsel, do you wish to proceed on the domestic petition?" He glanced at his files and shook his head. "No, Your Honor." The judge closed that folder. Miriam opened the next, the one marked Cloud. She explained briefly that the messages came from a backup linked to George's Apple ID, still synced because Elaine had never changed the password when she upgraded her phone. She did not read emotions. She only read words, including the 2 that changed the room, Plan B. She then read the reply. "He works dangerous. Accidents happen." The judge's pen stopped moving. For a moment, the hum of the air vents was the only sound. The judge lifted her eyes to Elaine. "Mrs. Whitman, do you understand the meaning of those exchanges?" Elaine's throat moved. "It was a joke," she said. "I was upset." "You were discussing insurance," the judge said, flat. "We will not decide crimes in this room, but the record will be referred." Miriam did not press. She yielded the floor and let the words sit. Then she returned to numbers. She presented receipts of heirlooms loaded into trucks with dates from the neighbors' photos and stills from George's cameras. She presented bank confirmations that the siphon account and HELOC funds were currently frozen, pending identity verification. She showed joint account statements that recorded George paying utilities, taxes, insurance, and maintenance even while away. He did not abandon the household, she said. He paid for it. She finished with Granite Orchard, the holding company created 8 years earlier. She showed returns to prove taxes were paid and titles were clean. "This is not concealment," she said. "This was risk management, built after Mr. Whitman watched a friend lose everything in a rushed divorce." Elaine's attorney tried to paint Granite Orchard as a secret. Miriam slid forward the IRS transcripts and the corporate filings with dates and signatures. "No secret to the government," she said. "No secret to any court that asks." When she finished, the judge stacked the files, took off her glasses, and spoke in a voice meant for records. This case shows a planned extraction of marital assets, a forged encumbrance on the home, and an attempted quick sale under market value, she said. The court orders full return of identifiable transfers to Mr. Whitman. The home remains solely in his name based on prior title. The HELOC is frozen, pending the bank's fraud process and possible criminal charges. The domestic petition is dismissed. Spousal support is denied at this time. Then she looked at the Plan B pages again and added, the court refers these messages and related materials to the district attorney for review. The bailiff took the file. The clock showed 9:47. 12 minutes had changed a life again. Outside in the hall, Elaine's attorney asked for a conversation. Miriam said any conversation would be through filings. Elaine stepped toward George as if to speak, then stopped. He did not move. He kept his hands light on the folder and watched her go. There was no victory speech in him. There was only relief that felt like cool air after a storm. At 10:30, Miriam, Caleb, and George walked to the bank with the orders. A manager checked the judge's signatures, compared IDs, and clicked through screens. The siphoned funds would be returned within banking days. The HELOC would remain locked while the fraud unit forwarded the file. The bank printed 4 confirmations. Miriam added them to the binder, wrote the date in the margin, and closed the clip. At noon, they drove back to the house. A court inventory team met them on the porch with a clipboard and a camera. 2 officers stood by the door. The study looked strange and bare where boxes had been stacked. The oak desk still sat under the window. Its surface showed the pattern of a lamp that had been there for years. A light spot and a darker ring. George ran his fingers along the edge and found a small nick he had sanded smooth the summer he restored it. He put his hand flat on the wood. He did not say anything. He walked the hallway with the inventory officer, named each picture and clock and chair that would stay, and wrote down 3 items that were missing, so the list was exact for insurance. He changed the codes on the security panel and set a temporary pass for the court team. He called a locksmith and scheduled new locks for dusk. Harold met him on the driveway and clapped him once on the shoulder. They spoke about small things. Mail held at the post office, a stray sprinkler head that kept the moment steady. At 3:15, Miriam left with the files and promised to send scanned copies by evening. Caleb went to his car to call a client. George stood alone in his kitchen and looked at the mark on the counter where a hot pot had once sat. He poured a glass of water and drank it to the bottom. He went room by room and opened every window for 10 minutes to let the house breathe. He closed them again and turned the thermostat up 2 degrees. He wrote a simple list on a pad by the phone. Locksmith, change Wi-Fi, call the insurance agent, confirm with the court inventory team, stack boxes for charity. When the locksmith arrived at 5:40, George held the door and thanked him twice. When the sun flattened behind the trees, he sat at the oak desk, opened the top drawer, and found a small packet of old photos that had been pushed to the back. One showed his parents in front of this same house, decades younger, the same window behind them. He set it upright and let the room go quiet. There was mystery left in the day. The missing pieces, the question of how far Dylan would run, the jagged reason Elaine had walked this path. But it no longer owned the room. The judge's orders lay on the blotter like clean plans. The locks were turned, the power was steady, the house was his again, and he would live in it like a man who knew how to keep a system safe, one careful step at a time. 6 months later, George woke before sunrise in a small cabin north of Sandpoint, where the meadow turned silver with frost, and the pines held the air still. And he moved through a new morning, the way he used to move through a pre-shift checklist. Heat on low, kettle filled, back door open to test the hinge he had oiled last week, porch swept once with an old broom so he could see if any fresh tracks crossed the boards. A rabbit had passed in the night, and nothing else. He had sold the Midland house after the court inventory was complete, and the bank returned the siphoned funds, thanked Harold with a firm handshake and a bottle of the good coffee he liked, and shipped the oak desk, the picture frames, the clock, and 3 boxes of books north by a freight service that gave him a printed sheet for each crate. Granite Orchard still held the title to the land and the cabin, while the accountant filed dissolution papers in stages so every tax box stayed clean. Elaine's case had moved the way such things move when proofs are tidy, the domestic petition gone, the forged HELOC under review by the bank fraud team, the Plan B messages sent by the judge to the district attorney with a forwarding letter that said, "For consideration." 2 months in, the DA's office called and asked if he wanted notification of any charging decision. He said yes, gave them the new post office box 3 towns over, and then wrote the date and the agent's name on a yellow pad he kept in the top drawer of the desk. Elaine pled to forgery on the HELOC and signed a restitution plan that would take years to dent. There was no jail time, only 5 years probation, and a rule that kept her from opening new credit without permission. Dylan did not answer subpoenas. A small article from Arizona said a wellness consultant had been asked to leave a clinic after money went missing from a petty cash box. There was no charge, only a suggestion. George cut nothing out and kept no clippings. He built a fence on the south line where elk like to push, took 2 days to hang a gate square, and set the post rocks by hand because the soil there was loose. He stacked firewood by length and burn rate, so he could reach for the right piece without thinking when the nights turned hard. He tuned the old radio his father had left him and found a station that played weather at the top of the hour. He drove into town every other Tuesday for supplies and coffee at the diner, where the waitress called him Sir and remembered he liked his eggs dry. A Canadian company called with a consulting offer, and he said he would do 1 call a week, 2 hours, no travel, payment by wire to the same account every month. They agreed and sent a short contract. Miriam reviewed in an afternoon and returned with 2 small edits. He redid his will in plain language, named a niece and a local scholarship fund, and changed the beneficiary on the small life policy that had once started this worry. The agent sliding the new form across a laminate desk and tapping the line where he should sign. He kept his days simple. Mornings were for the property, afternoons for calls and small repairs, evenings for reading and for the habit of walking the fence line with a flashlight that he rarely used, because sunset lasted long this far north in fall. The oak desk sat by the east window where light came soft. The photo of his parents stood on the corner again. The same one that had looked wrong in the moving truck picture months earlier. Now it sat right, and the wood beneath it was warm in the hour after dawn. One afternoon, he opened the smallest drawer and found a thin brass key he did not recognize with a tag that only said S. He tried it in the old lock on the desk's center drawer, which he had repaired when he restored the piece years ago, but the key was a different cut. He set it in a small dish and left it there, a quiet curiosity that did not ask for a chase. The DA's letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October, crisp, official, light as paper is when it decides a thing without shouting. No charges on the insurance conspiracy due to the absence of the second party and the difficulty of proving intent beyond the messages. Referral noted, file stayed open for new information. He read it once at the counter and set it under a magnet next to a grocery list. Nails, flour, fuel stabilizer. He did not feel cheated. He felt the same cool acceptance he had learned in rooms where pumps failed and you fixed the pump and moved on. He called Miriam and thanked her for the work and asked her to finish dissolving Granite Orchard before year end. He phoned Harold and listened to a short update about the street in Midland, the new family who had moved in, the way their boy mowed crooked the first time and straight the next. He called Caleb and said they should fish in spring, and Caleb said they would. On the first hard freeze, he found a shallow crack in the line that fed the exterior spigot and cut, fitted, and soldered a new section, then watched the joint with a flashlight until the flux stopped smoking. 2 days later, he drove into town and donated the last 2 boxes of dishes he did not need, keeping only the chipped mug he used every morning and the good set for when a niece or a neighbor came through. He replaced the porch light with a higher lumen lamp and set a camera under the eave, not out of fear, but out of habit. He set aside an hour each week to write, not a speech or a story, just a page of notes about what he saw. A hawk holding in a crosswind, the smell of pine when he cut a fresh round, the way frost lifted off the grass at 9. When a brown envelope arrived with no return, only G. Whitman typed in a line that looked like a machine chose each letter. He stood at the counter and opened it with a butter knife. Inside was a postcard of tall palms and a blue sky and "Wish you were here" in handwriting that could have been anyone's, and no signature. The postmark said Palm Springs, and the date was 3 weeks old. He set it in the dish with the brass key and left both on the desk. He slept fine that night and every night after. If a car slowed on the road below the ridge, he could hear its tires on gravel, and he would step to the window, watch the dust rise, and wait for it to pass, which it always did. He did not speak ill of Elaine. He did not rehearse what he would say if she called. He had said what he needed to say on the first night when he wrote, "Finish rotation, land clean, be quiet." He kept to it. On the last day of the year, he signed the final Granite Orchard papers at the small table in the corner, stamped envelopes, and walked them to the mailbox at the end of the lane in a coat he had worn on 100 cold mornings far from land. He stood a minute and looked at the line of trees that marked his boundary and at the sky beyond them, and then he walked back. He put a log on the fire, sat at the oak desk, and checked the next day's list. Fix the loose hinge on the shed, check the fence near the creek, call the Canadian project manager at 2. He reached for the chipped mug and lifted it toward the window where the light had started to thin. He did not say a word. He did not need to. The house was quiet. The systems were sound, and the life he kept now moved in a clean line from one good task to the next. If the story kept someone awake at 2 in the morning, he would hope they learned this much from him. Build your redundancies, watch your gauges, and keep your hands steady when the message comes.